Hey students, we're back and we're back with the second of just the two videos for today's lesson. During our last video we went into an introduction, talked about brain training, talked about the strategies to enhance performance using psychological methods, and then we went into confidence and motivation. This video right now is going to go through sleep and performance as well as the arousal zones and optimal arousal. And when we talk about the arousal zone with the inverted U theory, there are some strategies that we can use to improve, increase or decrease arousal levels. And so we'll go through each of those as well. So don't forget that you should be building your set of notes so that by the end of this video and our next video, you're ready to go into some peak and some ed Rolo questions. I think I might have stated that in the previous video. That was an error. You need to make sure you've done this one. So here we go. Now, the first one is about sleep and performance. What's really interesting here is that a lot of these researchers are still continuing, and every year the study design changes because more research comes out. We actually know that lack of sleep results in poor sporting performance, but it's not always clear exactly what the number one reason is that makes that change. And so, while many of the outcomes are known, and they're those physiological methods, it is actually linked to the psychological state of the athlete as to why those physiological changes take place with lack of sleep. So because there is sleep debt or a lack of sleep, we have a decreased ability to metabolize glucose for energy production. We have increased levels of stress hormones. They haven't dissipated overnight. We have decreased activity of a human growth hormone for tissue repair, which means that you still feel sore and you're injured. We have decreased aerobic endurance because there's no burning of fats while the athlete is sleeping. We have an increased perceived exertion because of the tiredness being excreted in the hormones in the brain. And we have an increased moodiness. When people are tired, they are grumpy. So an overall reduce in brain function and the ability to make decisions means that active movement and physical activity and exercise does become more challenging, which are some of the psychological reasons as to why the physiological performance would be decreased. What's interesting is with a matter of days, there are significant declines in an athlete's performance, and it can have devastating effects on what their psychological state with their motivation, their confidence, their arousal levels and concentration might be. So if somebody changes their sleep pattern for 2 days, that could mean just sleeping in longer on weekends. It can significantly upset the body clock. Cramming for exams at the last minute, which you guys might be in a situation at the moment, and having sleep deprivation for 1 to 2 days can cause reduced brain function, which is not a great idea. So maximize your chances by having a quiet, dark, cool place and a comfortable bed to sleep will help with that method. And it mentions here as well about athletes who travel, and when they do travel they need to make sure that they move to their accommodation a few days prior so that they can acclimatize and get good sleep patterns. Now, in regards to arousal, we want to achieve optimal arousal. So arousal is somebody's readiness when they experience and face a task, how activated they are, ready and excited to complete a task. We have a flow or a zone in an inverted U graph, which shows what the optimal level of arousal is. So if you have a look at this diagram here, similar to what we saw with confidence earlier, if somebody is anxious, okay, because they're too highly aroused, they actually will perform quite low on their performance level. And if somebody has a low level of arousal, they're not excited, they're going to have the same low level of performance. So what we want is a real blend in the middle of arousal. Now, everybody's zone or flow is slightly different, but to perform the optimal performance level, we want to have a medium level of high and low arousal levels. So when we have a look at arousal levels, if somebody is low, they will perform poorly. They show low levels of motivation, they're bored, they're tired, Their muscles feel heavy and lethargic. Their concentration drops. Their enthusiasm is low. So you can see how that will lead to poor performance. But also, if somebody is too highly anxious or aroused or excited about performance, they might suffer because they feel tense, excited, anxious. Their muscles are tensing up. Their movements become jerky because there's not that smooth flow of messages from brain to muscle. So the coordination drops and the mistakes will increase. Athletes must take responsibility for controlling their own arousal levels, because in a team situation, if one person is too low or highly aroused and they have low performance, this can be a demotivator for the remainder of that team. So we now look here and say, what can low or high arousal levels, or not being in the right arousal zone, do to a team? Well, people can feel not prepared, teammates not perform well, lack dedication that can perform conflict within a team. Teammates and opponents might behave poorly, which can change that. Officiating can change someone's arousal or excitable levels. Not having enough time for a social life can mean that somebody becomes under-aroused to perform at a high level. So it's a really interesting blend that professional athletes need to work through to try and have the optimal level of arousal and therefore the optimal level of performance as they work through it. So a lot of sports competitions will do these surveys and tests. The assistant coaches will ask the players to fill them out, and you can read through some of these questions and find out, if you have a look at these answers, whether you have high level or moderate anxiety levels or anxiousness. And when we have a moderate or an optimal level of arousal, then the score will be within the right zone and that athlete is ready to perform. And sometimes you need to look at which one of these are you answering often to and which ones of them are you answering sometimes or never to, so which ones can you make changes to. So when we talk about making changes to arousal, we are talking about making sure that the athlete is staying within that zone, that optimal performance zone. If they are in the high arousal area, we need to bring it back down. If they are in the low arousal area, we need to bring it back up. So, some of the strategies we can use to reduce arousal is progressive muscle relaxation. Now, I believe I went through this with some of you guys in the weights area one day, and it's good to practice this for 20 to 30 minutes every day for athletes, but it's when an athlete slows down, they lie down, they start by tensing one part of their body, it might be their forehead, and they tense it for 5 to 10 seconds, and then they slowly release all of the tension in that muscle. Then they move to their face, their neck, their upper arms, their forearms. Some athletes will move the other way. They'll go from toes all the way up to the head. And by tensing and relaxing, you release pressure and you reduce arousal levels. The next method you can use to reduce arousal level is meditation. Meditation is all about focusing. It's powerful for the mind, body, and soul, and it's about exercising the mind by focusing your attention to something and shutting out the cognitive processes of other things like decision making. So concentration is an important factor here, to have athletes focus on one thing, close their eyes, block out everything else. And what that can do is also decrease arousal levels if an athlete is sitting too high on that curve and you want to bring them back down to perform much higher. The next one is breathing control, helps relax and refocus. There's an example here which is about controlled breathing, trying to slow the heart rate down even, which is just about focusing on taking slow, deep breaths, ensuring that the lungs totally fill with air and that oxygen can be transported around the body, and then focusing on following through that process over and over. Some of the more refined techniques is like an example here, biofeedback, which uses electronic instruments to look at heart rate, muscle tension, and skin temperature, and gives a reading to an athlete that they have tension or high anxiety or arousal levels within their body. And so one of the things that can be used is in terms of a biofeedback tool, then bringing in some of that controlled breathing, meditation, or progressive muscle relaxation if a specific part of the body is specifically tense. The final one is about stress inoculation training, and the word inoculation means to bring in. So by stress inoculating athletes, they actually reduce the effects of what stress can do, because athletes become more adapted and learn to cope with small amounts of stress. They build up an immunity to it and form positive thoughts. So by instilling stress throughout training sessions in low stress situations, you train the athlete when they do suffer from higher stress situations to use some of the same techniques to bring themselves back down to where they need to be. Now, these series of things that you can do, or techniques, are about promoting arousal. So this is when an athlete is sitting too low on the inverted U curve and low levels of arousal, and want to bring that back to a moderate level so that we're in the optimal zone for high performance. And so some of the things that you can do here are elevated breathing. So taking some more rapid and quick breaths. That helps not only bring the heart rate up to pace, but also just wake the body up and more excite the athlete and focus on them ready to go. One thing that they can do is also move their feet and their arms in the action of the game, like a tennis example there where it says focusing on your stroke play, for example. That can actually help bring arousal levels up. Next thing that you could do is act energetically. It sounds pretty basic, but it makes sense that bumping into each other, lightly slapping each other, getting physical with each other in change rooms before you take to the field in a game of AFL or rugby, as you have seen, is one of the things that actually helps improve arousal techniques for athletes, but needs to be very careful, because if an athlete is already within their optimal zone, this could push them as too highly aroused. Finally, positive talk. Positive talk also means listening to upbeat, up-tempo music, which I know a lot of athletes and a lot of people will do to try and bring people into the zone, as we would use in layman's terms, but essentially prepare you better with your arousal levels, ready for the sport or the competition or the game coming up. When we talk about positive talk, we're talking about eliminating any negative words from the conversation piece and doing things like, instead of saying, "Oh, I don't play well in the wet," say, "Well, I've played well in the wet before. I just need to keep it simple and I'm good to go. What if I miss this kick? No, you've done this kick a million times in practice. Think of how good it'll be when you do kick that goal." Changing negative into positive thoughts is something that athletes will practice and perform highly at when they've had that practice. I'm very hopeful that you guys have a really good understanding of different arousal patterns. The inverted U theory, you'll notice I put an asterisk next to that in the video. The reason being is that the inverted U is the one thing from this whole chapter that I've seen most often in the VCE examination. So be prepared to answer questions about improving or increasing or decreasing the arousal of athletes and using those different techniques that were just mentioned to you, and trying to bring an athlete back into the optimal zone of arousal so that they have the highest level of performance. With all of these things, it's all about improving the performance of the athlete and ensuring that the athlete can perform when they need to perform in competition phase.